Thank you all for coming this evening. My name is Jeff Garmany. I'm a lecturer in the Brazil Institute, and on behalf of my colleagues in all of the global institutes, and in particular Louise, Tillin, and Vanesa, Pesque-Cela, who have worked very hard with me to organize and to bring together this event tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Global Institutes Forum. Now, the Global Institutes Forum is sort of a continuation of an event that we hosted last year called the Distinguished Speaker Series, the Distinguished Lecture Series. This is, in truth, it's really just sort of a change in name, where we continue to examine a number of the same topics that we began to investigate last year. And in a sense, it's a chance to bring together speakers from a wide range of disciplines, from also a wide range of countries, of course, as well, who have expertise in India, China, and Brazil, to begin to talk about some of the larger sort of shared issues that these countries and the world currently face together. I would be amiss not to thank also Jacqueline Armit, our administrator in the Brazil Institute, who also with her colleagues, Ralph and Alonjana, have worked to bring this event together. And we welcome you afterwards. There will be, starting at about 8 o'clock, a reception here in the back. So, the Global Institutes Forum, organized into two panel sessions across the 2012 and 2011, or 2012-2013 academic year, seeks to cultivate debate and draw upon multidisciplinary perspectives to investigate questions of political economy and sustainable development in Brazil, China, and India. In the first of these two panel sessions this evening, we turn our attention to issues of urban growth and the effects of globalization in cities throughout Brazil, China, and India. Boasting several of the world's largest cities, these three countries now confront a host of concerns related to internal and international migration, global and regional network development, basic urban infrastructure, and socioeconomic inequality. Related to this are even deeper questions of citizenship and human rights, access to democratic institutions, and ever-evolving national restructuring plans. Titled Urban Futures, Space and Citizenship in Cities of Brazil, China, and India, this first panel session seeks to provide insight into several of the world's most pressing urban issues. I'll go ahead and introduce the speakers on the panel this evening, beginning immediately here to my right. This is Professor Amitabh Kundu, a professor of economics at the Center for the Study of Regional Development and the Dean of the School of Social Sciences at JNU New Delhi. He has worked as the director at various institutes such as the National Institute of Urban Affairs, the Indian Council of Social Science Research, and the Gujarat Institute of Development Research. He's also worked on the editorial board for several academic journals and maintains an exceptionally rigorous research agenda. His work considers a diverse set of topics related to development and urban growth in India, and most recently, he's investigated such topics as social and human development, inequality and mobility, poverty and vulnerability in urban settings, and even the role of science and religion in processes of development and urbanization. Immediately to his right is Professor Yaping Wang from the School of the Built Environment at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. There, Professor Wang also serves as the director at the Scottish Centre for Chinese Urban and Environmental Studies. Dr. Wang's research considers multiple questions of contemporary Chinese and East Asian urbanization and holds a particular focus upon housing, land development, and social change. And then finally, at the end, we have Professor Eduardo Marques from the Department of Political Science at the University of Sao Paulo. In addition to his teaching and graduate student mentorship, Dr. Marques holds several leadership advisory positions within, among others, organizations such as the International Sociological Association and the Brazilian National Institute of Science and Technology in Metropolitan Studies. His research considers a host of issues related to contemporary urbanism, including such topics as politics and health, habitation and infrastructure, urban segregation and poverty, and social inequality in urban space. He also has a new book that has just been published in 2012 by Ashgate titled Opportunities and Deprivation in the Urban South, Social Networks, Poverty, and Segregation in Sao Paulo. If you would please welcome me and join in welcoming our speakers tonight. So each of our speakers will present for roughly 20 minutes, and this will be followed by a question and answer period where we actually have a microphone that we can pass around the audience. This event is actually being recorded, and a podcast is being kept of it. So we want to make sure that if you have a question, we capture that on the microphone. And then afterwards, as I said, there will be a reception. So if you are unable to ask your question during the question and A period, you can ask one of our speakers right afterwards and speak to them directly. So without further ado, I think we'll begin to my immediate right here with Professor Kundu, please.
Thanks. Wonderful. Thank you. Dr. Jeff Germany, friends in the panel, colleagues and researchers, I must say it's an honor and privilege for me to be part of this panel and talk to this very distinguished group of researchers at the King's College, London. Since, as a captain, Jeff has asked me to open the innings, I thought I'll just contextualize Indian urban scenario within the global economic framework. 4 decades, the coming 4 decades have been predicted to be the period of progressive shift of the epicenter of urbanization from predominantly northern latitudes of developed countries to the southern ones of developing countries in Asia, with the alarm signal, or if you want to consider it as a golden pronouncement, that there will be an urban avalanche in Asia led by India and China, quote unquote, from the Asian Development Bank. If you look at the growth scenario in urban field, you do find that in the second half of the last century, that is 1950 to 2000, Latin American countries experienced very rapid growth, which really took the percentage of urban population in Latin America from something like 41% to 76%. Africa did the same, but that happened only up to 1970. After that, it slowed down. Predictions are being made that India is going to now do the same thing what Brazil did, or Argentina did, or Mexico did in the second half of the last century. Now, when you look at the growth map of different countries as predicted by the international development cum banking organizations, you do find that the map of economic growth is going to be very different from the map of the levels of economic development. I'm saying growth in GDP is going to be very different than the per capita GDP that is available across the countries, the data as given by the international banking organizations like the World Bank or IMF. What is predicted is that overall OECD's growth rate will be somewhere less than 3% per annum for the next 2 decades, which is at below the global average. But many of the Asian countries are going to record something like 5 to 7%. India's predicted growth rate is 6.8%, China 7.2%. And understandably, this will also affect the urban growth rate. And there's absolutely no doubt that the urban growth scenario globally across the countries is going to be very, very different from the percentage of urban population or level of urbanization. Now, the United, whenever you make a projection of the growth of any country, including India, sometimes you tend to ignore the demographic weight of that country. For example, in the Indian context, it's mentioned that India had 8% share of the total urban population in 1950. Now the percentage share has gone up to 10%. India's share in the incremental urban population has been something like 12%. All these figures are impressive, but we must not forget that India contributes 17 to 18% of the global population. And the growth rate of population has been much faster than the rest of the world. You must be reading in the international literature that India had no 10 million plus city in 1970. Now India has 10 million plus cities. In another decade, India will have 10 million plus cities. Again, if you analyze it, you do find that there are many cities which were just below that cutoff point in India. And since the population growth rate in these cities are larger than the cities in the rest of the world that can be easily calculated, you do find that they cross the cutoff point, and this population growth rate in these cities is largely because of socio-cultural factors or the fertility factors. Look at the United Nations projection that was made in 2000, around that time, that the world's urban population will become half of the global population by 2005-06. That was the projection, that the world will become 50% urban in 2005-06. With some hiccups, we finally achieved that. If you want to call it a landmark, you can say that, but it's basically a milestone. In 2009, we achieved that. Why was this delay? The delay is basically because many of the Asian countries experienced urban growth rate much less than the projected by the United Nations Population Division, which brings out every alternate year world urbanization prospects. Now the point is, for India, they had projected much higher growth rate. Subsequently, they brought it down. I can show it to you. Look at this projection made by the World Urbanization Prospects. In 1995, that is revision 94, India's growth rate of urban population for the year 2025 to 30 was projected to be 3.25%. Last year, revision 2009, they lowered it down to 2.34% per annum for the same year, 2025 to 30. And revision 2010, which came before 6 months, has revised it further down to 2.03. Basically, what I'm trying to say, that the projection model, which has been used by the international organization, UN Population Division, which is globally accepted, and also many of the national government take these projected figures pretty seriously. I think one should find out, why is it this prediction of urban avalanche being made? Is it something because of the model? Indeed, the model which is used by United Nations Population Division to project population figures for India, China or Brazil, they have built-in bias of showing a higher growth rate of urban population for the countries that have less than 50% population in urban areas. It's a modified logistic model, and that assumes that if the Asian countries are having less than 50% population in the urban centers, its growth rate has to be very high. When it was noted that year after year the projected figures are on the higher side, they tried to modify this logistic model to some extent by putting in a regression equation with 113 countries. But still we find that the growth rate of population given by the UN turns out to be much on the higher side. I've already mentioned how it has been revised downwards, but I just wanted to show this figure. I'm sorry it's not shown very clearly because of the color combination chosen by me, but you see that 2000 to 2005, that is the period for which data is reliable, because 2005 to 10, many countries, they don't have the official data released, there will be projected figures. You do find that Indian growth rate of urban population is not very high. This is the UN data, 2.35. This is much less than whole Asia, Africa. It's less, of course, it is higher than North America or the Latin American countries, but these countries have already achieved 80% level. But look at the decline in the growth rate of urban population from 3.89 to 2.35. The maximum decline has taken place in case of India. This is the again official UN figure. Now, given this dramatic decline and a low growth rate at the moment, it is not really clear how one can accept that the growth rate of urban population should be taken as very high as 2.56, and look at the projections which is being given for 2025 to 2030. This is URGD, urban rural growth differential, which in a way takes account of the population growth factor. If you take that, you find India's projected figure is much on the higher side, and one would like to find out how come this consistently higher figure is being reported despite the fact that the population census is showing much lower growth rate of urban population. I would like to argue that this arrogance of a model which tries to project the urban population or urban growth rate for large countries like India, China, Brazil, based on only two information: past urban growth rate and percentage of urban population. That's the kind of a model which is generally used. Now that, I have a feeling, needs to be questioned. That kind of an, arrogance cannot go unchallenged. Because I think if you are making projection for large countries where history, social structure plays an important role, you ought to include these parameters into the projection system. And with that, let's have a look at the growth rate of urban population, the Indian scenario. You can see that the percentage of urban population, which is shown by the bars, they show an increase. But as far as the growth rate of urban population is concerned, between 1901 to 1911, it was almost 0%. It has started rising consistently. In 1961, there was a decline because the highest growth rate was reported that time in 1951. That was the first census conducted after independence, and many of the princely states declared their big villages as urban because of their status. But 1961 census formally standardized the definition and the growth rate came down. I made the adjustment for the definitional factor, but what emerges very clearly is that the growth rate of urban population in India continued to rise in a way up to 1981. 1971-81 was the highest growth rate of urban population, which was 3.8% during 71-81. 81-91 sees a drop to 3.1%, and 91-2001 urban growth rate comes down further to 2.73%. And if you look at 2001-2011, we have just got the data before 3-4 months, the growth rate more or less remains constant, 2.73, it goes up to 2.76. If you look at the relationship with the income growth rate, this is the curve for the per capita income. You just smoothen it, you find the index of per capita income shows jump in the slope. The slope is showing us actually the rate of growth, and certainly you find there is a relationship between economic growth and urbanization. If you compare this income growth rate and also urbanization growth rate with China, you do find that the Chinese urbanization rate was less than India up to 1981, but after that, urban growth rate in China has been much higher. Now, if you look at the economic growth scenario, and if you want to extend it to 1901, would you believe this curve will fall straight flat? Because from 1901 to 1950, the growth rate of national income in India was less than 0.5% per year. This, if you compare with Brazil with the Portuguese influence, you still had 5.6% growth rate per annum during 1901 to 1950. As a result, urban growth rate also much higher than India. But as I said, in India, the economic growth was so low that it didn't have much impact. In fact, in many decades there was de-urbanization. Now, let us look at the present scenario of 2001 and 2011. You see, the growth rate has really remained more or less constant. But if you are a second decimal demographer, you would say, look, 2.73 has gone up to 2.76. There's an increase of 0.03 percentage point. There is something happening in the urbanization front. I would, in a way, agree with that. You know why? Because urban growth rate has been coming down. At least you have been able to stall the decline of the urban growth rate. And second point is, which is more important, that the population growth rate in India for the first time has gone down. It was 2.1, 2.2%. Now it went down to 1.93. Currently it will be somewhere between 1.4 and 1.5. Despite the decline in the population growth rate, which affected urban and rural both, if the percentage of urban population has been maintained, that certainly shows people are expecting something is happening in the urban front. Migration must be picking up. Now, I would like to tell you that the migration data for India would be available only from the census after 3-4 years. But we have national sample survey data from 65th round, 2007-8. Does it really show that the rural-urban migration has gone up? Unfortunately not. Take the adult males that plays the key role in urbanization in Asian countries. You find percentage of adult male migrating from rural to urban areas have gone down from 33% to 32%, just by 1 percentage point. But migration of women have gone up from rural to urban areas, from 24% to 26%. That 65% of the women migration in India is because of their joining their families or marriage. There is an economic factor which is gradually coming up. I do believe that urban labor market is offering opportunities for women, marginally at the top level, but largely in the domestic sector. Large percentage of the women migrants are getting absorbed in the domestic sector. That could be a factor, but nonetheless, the small increase in the women migration in urban areas would not explain the urban growth rate remaining stable. There is something else which I would like to mention, which is responsible for urban growth rate not coming down. What is that? 2011 census for the first time has identified 2,800 new towns. If you take 1901 to 2001, 100 years, the total number of new towns was 2,300 only. In one decade, 2001 to 2011, there are 2,800 towns which have come up. Why is it so? Partly, I believe, there is a census activism which is playing a role. There are very eminent scholars like Arvind Pangadia. Today he's giving a lecture in Delhi. I was supposed to moderate that discussion. Jagdish Bhagwati. They have really questioned the Indian census data. They said that census is not capturing the dynamism of the urban centers. I heard Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who is really chief of the statistical system, before about a year and a half, he did tell the statisticians, sorry, urban data and migration data are not really reflecting the reality. And the World Bank also takes their position. If you look at 2009, with some amount of arrogance, the title is Reshaping Economic Geography. It has calculated urban percentage for India by using a GIS technique and built up area, basically decontextualizing urbanization from history and culture. But the figure that they have proposed is 52% urban in India and 48% for China. I would like to argue, I have looked at the definitional factors elsewhere. I really don't think, if you compare internationally, Indian definition is very restrictive. But even if it's so, even if you assume that Indian definition of urban center is restrictive, you would find that it will make a change one time. The growth rates would not be affected. And I would like to argue that the growth rate in urban population is low and slowing down, basically because the urban upper class and the urban middle class, the big middle class that is emerging in India, is capturing the urban space. There's a large scale eviction in the large cities of the poor migrants. They are put in the degenerated peripheries where, along with the slum dwellers, informal pollutant activities are being located. And to a certain extent, the rural employment guarantee program is also contributing to slowing down of migration. But there is absolutely no doubt that the cities in India have become hostile or not very friendly to the poor, dispossessed migrants, and that is evident from the changing character of the migrants. How am I doing in terms of time? Another 5 minutes?
Another 2 minutes.
Okay. I just wanted to quickly show you the structure of urbanization. You see the percentage of population in 5 million plus cities in India is already very high. You see Europe, Africa, less developed countries, world average, developed countries, Asia, South Central Asia. This is the share of 5 million plus cities to the total urban population. This is extremely high, and presently there is a proposal that we should have 87 million plus cities created in another 2 decades. That's the suggestion coming from McKinsey Global Institute. It's also suggestion coming from high-powered expert committee headed by Isha Ahluwalia. There's a big debate going on at the moment whether we can create large 7 cities connecting Delhi and Mumbai in the arid zone. Where will water come from? These are the issues that I don't want to get into, but I simply want to mention that going by the empirical data, you do find that although in the past large cities grew at a rapid pace, during 2001 and 2011, there has been a decline in the migration in the larger cities. You take 24 largest cities, excepting Bengaluru and Puducherry, there is a decline in the migration rate and in the growth rate of population in the large cities. Large cities have become exclusionary because they are trying to create space for the global capital and also local entrepreneurs to come up. Just I'll take 1 more minute just to show some changing character of the migrant population. This is from the 65th round of the National Sample Survey data. You find that the percentage of migrants is declining from the population census figures. As far as NSS data is concerned, percentage of male migrants have remained constant or slightly declining, but percentage of women migrants in the urban areas have slightly gone up. Now this graph compares migrants and non-migrants in terms of the reasons for migration. You find that looking for employment, economic distress being the factor which still remains, but it has gone down from 40% to 37%. Business-related movement and studies, that is contributing larger share. This is where are the migrants getting absorbed. You can't say that the migrants are worse off than the non-migrants. Migrants are getting into non-agricultural occupations. Their percentage figure has gone up. This is the educational standards. You do find that among the migrants, there are lesser percentage of illiterates below primary and primary, and among the migrants there are higher percentage of those who have graduate degree, higher secondary education, and the figure has improved over time. And this is the, in terms of expenditure data also, you can clearly see that the migrants are doing somewhat better than the non-migrants, and percentage of migrants in the higher expenditure category is better. Basically, I would like to conclude by saying that analysis of the migration trend suggests that the poor people's window of opportunity to moving to the urban areas have gradually closed. Percentage of poor in the mega cities, million plus cities, was 30% in 93-94. Now it has gone down to 11% by Tendulkar Committee's estimates. Basically, by 2050, our population in India will go up from 1200 million to 1600 million. Additional 420 million people would be asking for jobs. I think we have to have urbanization. There is no way out. But where do you put these 420 million? Should we create 40 or 60 million plus cities? And there are environmental issues, cost of infrastructure issues. That is one approach. The second approach would be to encourage those 2,800 new urban centers that have been identified. Can we stabilize their infrastructure and see to it that they absorb the 420 million additional labor force who would ask for non-agricultural jobs? I think Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, which was launched before 7 years, increased allocation for the urban population 7-8-fold, but only confined to 65 big cities. I would think that the government and the 12th plan at the moment is being finalized. They are considering these two alternatives. I believe that they should be also considering the alternative of stabilizing the small and medium towns infrastructure, the 2,800 urban centers that I have mentioned. I'm sorry, my captain, I put it down.
Well, firstly, I would like to say thank you, Vanesa and the King's College for organizing this and invite me to come to speak to this so lovely room. And I think Professor Kundu already said something about the international trend, and that would actually set a quite good background for me to focus on China. And also, China is such a big country and things moving so fast. And just talking about China, I feel it's enough for me to hand over this 20 minutes. And I prepared to say three things this evening here. And firstly, I would say a bit about the urban trend in China. And we know urbanization in China is a quite big issue which have a major impact on Chinese society, but also have a major impact on the global economic and social development as well. And secondly, I will say a bit about the spatial and social patterns emerged in the Chinese cities, and which could be useful schemes for people to understand the Chinese cities better. And thirdly, I would go to a few major problems I think is crucial for the future development of urbanization in China. And so this will be what I have planned. Urbanization in China actually changed quite a lot in the last 30 years. We know during Chairman Mao's period, China pursued this so-called industrialization without urbanization or under-urbanization. Cities didn't grow, and factories, industries have been put into city suburban areas. But since Chairman Mao died, China opened up and followed a quite totally different approach. And urbanization became a major feature of China's development. And we're all talking about global urban population reach half of the total population in China. Actually, we also just reached 50% a year ago. And this year, it's about 51%. But this all depends on how you define urban population. The Chinese urban population definition is strange compared to many other countries. And with that to 51%, everyone have an urban lifestyle or living in the big cities. It's quite difficult to say. But urbanization does happen. Cities grew, more people living in cities. And there was an estimate in the last 10, 15 years, it was about 1% shift of people from rural registration to urban areas. Rural to urban, not necessarily change the registration. If people do population in China, you know the hukou is quite different. And they also estimate for the next 20 years about 1% urban population growth. And Chinese policy makers now believe urbanization is good, in contrast to Chairman Mao's period. And they would like to achieve about 70-75% of urban population in 20 or 30 years' time, so they can match with a developed world in the urbanization sense. And if we look at the number of cities, it's also quite striking. That's why China's urbanization is so important. And in the 1950s, there's a handful of cities in China which have any impact on the global economic development. And if we just look at the last row, 2010, that from the official statistics, China have 125 cities with residents over 1 million. And because of definition, the Chinese cities have a bigger hinterland. I guess it probably is around 100 if we talk about realistic urban areas rather than the administrative boundaries. So each statistic could give you a different number. And 657 cities in total, that is quite a lot of cities, actually. And in China, I just checked yesterday, there is 30 cities with permanent residence population over 8 million in China at the moment, of which 13 of them have residents over 10 million. This, about 20 years ago, none of the cities will be classified in this kind of category. And the urban population change, and also one of the important features in China is the differences of the official urban residents and the migrants come from a rural area living in cities. The major change over the last 10, 15 years is mainly caused by the migrant shifting from rural to urban areas. I'll give you an example here from Beijing. And you can see in 1995, 85% of the population in Beijing was locally registered. And in 2010, which down to 64%. So 36% of the population in Beijing, about 7 million out of 20 million, is migrant workers. So the migrants, they are come to living in the city, working in the city, but not necessarily registered. The 51% population statistics, the government recently changed it. They include migrant workers living in the city for more than 6 months. So the 51% actually include migrant workers. So if you, according to the traditional Chinese counting, if you take about 30% of people away, so the Chinese real urbanization level is down to 35, less than 40%. Because this migration and speed expanding of Chinese cities, I identified, I would like to emphasize, we can look at the Chinese urban development from 2 perspectives. One is the officially presented cities, planned by professional planners, built on fresh agricultural land. And so that is the normal process of urbanization. If you read official reports of things in China, that is the most emphasized based on. But there is another important urbanization process in China, which is the rural area changing their lifestyles, production, and people's employment patterns, which is the so-called traditional rural villages located in the suburban areas, which have been swapped into the city, but they remained some kind of rural characteristics. In China, people refer to this urban villages or villages inside the cities. So the development is a more informal, family-based, small business-based, Most of the migrant workers actually living in this kind of areas. So there's two important process of urbanization in China, and the second one have not been given enough research inside China and internationally. It's only drawing more attentions very recently. And this probably is not that important because I just give a better image about the two different approach of urban development. These are the more formal development. This is all from Shenzhen because I do a lot of research on the migrant workers there. So the central areas and built on fresh agricultural land and are the central administrative district, commercial areas, residential housing areas. So these are some of the images of the proper planned urban development. These are the second urban village, the informal oriented development. And I have did some migrant surveys in 13 of urban villages in Shenzhen. These are typical examples of the village changes. We can still find some of the very old houses, but most of the household demolished that, built up, trying to rent to migrant workers. So the farmers become part of the urban resident. They say, we are not farming food anymore, we are farming houses. And there were special names for this. They refer it as kissing buildings or shake hand buildings. Neighbors can kiss each other through the windows on the 6th or 5th floors. The spatial and the community changes in China is also quite important. And this diagram I have been using in many of my papers, revising every year, trying to take on new features. Traditional Chinese city before the 1949 Kremlin communist was quite small, handicraft-based life, administrative oriented. And the socialist period built that pink areas, the so-called work unit. Many of them are factories, and because their strategic location, they are specified, somehow be closed down and become real estate development opportunities. And all the circles outside represent the urban expansion under the economic reform period. In the 80s and 90s, they are distinctly different patterns. And neighborhoods have been built for the rich, for the super rich, for the relocated poor, and for the migrant workers' dormitory areas. So the urban, if on the Kremlin period is poor, equally poor, now it's very divided. The key word for the Chinese urban development is divided cities, and most of them are gated communities, and normal people just don't go to those areas at all. So I put a few arrows in the middle, shows the development pressure. The developers are trying to get more land from the pink areas. They also try to get more land from farmers, create a lot of tensions between the urban and the rural communities. And about the problems, I think the land in China is the key problem. Every day you got reports about disputes between the farmers and between the developers and the local government. Someone just done that research. I think China's Social Science Academy just find about 60% urban built-up increase between 2000 and 2010. Over that 10-year period, on average, urban area expanded by 60%. And large cities expand faster than smaller ones. And this creates quite a big problem. Most of the Chinese large cities built are on flat, fertile agricultural land. So the issue about the loss of land is a major issue. There's a lot of policy arrangement mechanism to try to control it, but it just can't stop the consuming of the agricultural land. I read a piece of news this week. The central government in China say this year China's grain import was probably will over 6 million tons. Wheat, rice, corn, all this kind of soya beans. Half of the world of the soya bean went to China. 6 million tons, I did a rough calculation how much that is. And if using the Chinese traditional standard, half a kilo per person, that is the ration for grain. And 6 million tons is a quarter of the total Chinese population's food supply. And if we think about half of the people living in city, half of the urban population's food is imported. Of course, some of China exports the food products of things, but this does cause some concerns about the land losses. Water and environmental problem is another big issue, and the Chinese urban area, high density, and with the new style of consumption of water, and water shortages traditionally is a problem, it's just become more serious. 400 cities of this 650 cities are short of water. And the water resources around all the cities get more and more short of supply. Apart from that, the pollution is also a quite big problem. And anyone visited China, you talk to the Chinese people just don't trust anything. Food, drinks, milk, baby powders, everything. And people just want to buy from Hong Kong. And so this environmental issue, it causes quite a big problem in China. The other most important issue I feel is the social economic inequalities. And I draw this diagram to try to show the regional and social differences. And from the bottom of the top, I try to represent the inland poor regions and towards the coast richer regions. And the largest from left to right represent the rural, the urban villages, the cities, and global international integration. So within this kind of system, and we see a lot of money, resources, labor flow just in China from smaller places to bigger places, from poor places to richer places. So this kind of important trend, probably that's why I put there says the China's Gini coefficient recently someone reported could be 0.6. That was striking. But this trend, it is quite important. The central government trying to pursue going west and let the inside of the cities become open cities. But the trend of this resource flow, it is still quite important problem in China. So based on this, there are many more other problems, but based on these problems, I think Chinese government also tried to adjust the urban development policies. You probably know they just published this 12 5-year plan recently. I read that quite carefully. There were small changes in it. And for example, the 城市化 in the past was always say this is good, but the central government changed the one word in the middle to 城镇化. 城市化 means everyone goes to cities. Urbanization just moving to cities. 城镇化, they try to perceive the urban as a system, from smaller settlement to middle-sized to large ones. The central government tried to persuade a more balanced, regionally balanced, large, small balanced urban network. But many researchers and policymakers in local areas still don't believe it. They say, well, we tried that during Chairman Mao's time. We even tried to do a rural-urban equality, but we failed. And I hope they would do that again. But they didn't realize in the past, Chairman Mao's time, people on bikes. Now everyone wants to drive their car. And the city is overcrowded. No one can move. So I think the policy, there's definitely some correct direction towards the policy side. And from my research, I always feel China can't afford to do the same thing for the next 10, 20 years. Okay. And we just can't get everyone of China moving to Pearl River Delta, Yangtze River Delta, and the Beijing-Tianjin area. But the Chinese feudalism tradition, the communist ideologies, the economic management system still draws the resources from the poor to the rich areas. But how to change this pattern, it takes quite a long time. And I think the policy is there, but how to achieve this requires many more research and study. But we know in China, millions of people moving, millions of houses are built without much careful study or planning. I'll probably just stop here. Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Okay. Up and down. Okay. Hi. I would like to start by thanking the organizers of this forum, especially Alvaro Comín and Jeff Garmany, for the opportunity to be here at King's and make this speech. Being said that, the task is not very simple, since cities are really complex phenomena, and I would have much to say about Brazilian cities to stick to my 20 minutes, what I'm really going to try. So I'll try to focus on the recent socio-economic transformations in and inside Brazilian cities, largest cities, in recent periods. And to be sure I'm going to stick to my time, I'm going to stick to my reading here. Well, Brazil is a highly urbanized country. 84% of its population lived in cities in 2010. It is also a country of large cities. In that same year, Brazil had 12 cities with more than 2 million inhabitants and 8 of the 15 largest Latin American metropolises, including the largest, São Paulo, with around 20 million, and the fourth, Rio de Janeiro, with a little bit more than 12 million. Brazil is therefore a country of many large, very large cities, although now with decreasing population growth, migration, and fertility rates. They tend to be very unequal social and spatially. This is a good picture of summarizes in a very eloquent way the social inequalities and income inequalities in Brazilian cities. Well, in this presentation, I'll try to do 3 things. First, describe the cities and their characteristics, then review the legacy of urban and housing policies that have forged the present situation, and thirdly, to discuss the recent social, urban, and political shifts since the return to democracy. So first, starting by presenting Brazilian metropolises. As is widely known, urbanization in Brazil is a relatively recent process dating from the 1940s. The process happened over a very short time span, driven primarily by fast and massive migration from rural areas to the major metropolises in the wealthiest parts of the country. These waves of migration were only partially absorbed by urban markets and industry, and consequently, unemployment and precarious jobs, the informal economy, became prevalent features of these cities. The spaces of poverty where these populations lived were marked by large-scale precarious settlements in favelas and peripheral and highly segregated places, where people self-built their homes. Living conditions in these places were highly vulnerable, and access to public services and population were low or non-existent given the authoritarian political environment of the time. During the same period, and in part associated with these processes, cities such as São Paulo became highly industrialized metropolis. Therefore, these inequalities did not stem from a lack of economic development, but from a success of a certain kind of economic development which produced inequalities continuously. Okay, sorry. This urban scenario formed the paradigm of Latin American metropolises. Their spatial structures were marked by heavy segregation, with the wealthier social groups located in central areas where scarce infrastructure and policies were located, while the poor and recently migrated population lived in vast, quite homogeneous and segregated peripheries in what have been called in the 70s the Brazilian metropolitan model, quote, quote. Showing only 3 maps very, very fast, which are very eloquent, I think, of the pattern of segregation in São Paulo. This is the distribution of high-income households, actually the last decile of the income distribution. As you can see, the darker, the richer, or the highest concentration of rich social groups. So you can see that they tend to concentrate very strongly at the center, but there are also other areas to the west, especially and to the north, associated to rich enclaves and closed condominiums. The same kind of result we get analyzing or seeing the distribution of social classes. These are the high-grade professionals, which are at the top of the occupational structure, and as you can see, they are very concentrated. And these are the skilled manual workers, which is for this labor force. And the good thing about this is to see that the 2 maps are actually a mirror of the other. Okay? So when you have one social group which is at the top, you don't have the social group which is at the bottom. Well, these peripheries were marked by the absence of infrastructure, by precarious and irregular settlements, and by favelas. The urban locations of the latter also included enclaves of poverty in more central areas. Like this one, for example. And in this picture you can see richer high-rise buildings, a favela, and housing projects which are actually trying to hide the favela from the highway, which is by its side. In terms of housing, basically 3 precarious housing solutions were developed by this population, poor population. Tenements, or cortiços in Portuguese, rented rooms in collective buildings where kitchens, bathrooms, and laundries were shared. They present today the worst sanitary and social conditions, but they tend to be very centrally located, and this is an advantage, like this. Favelas, collectively or individually occupied areas, which usually lack infrastructure and follow irregular patterns of physical occupation. What defines them, however, is the lack of land property of any kind, even though it's very common to find very dynamic markets of rent and sell plots inside favelas, but they are completely illegal. This is a picture of a favela, and this is another picture of a favela, only to show you very different kinds of settlements in favelas. And the third situation of precarious solution was irregular and clandestine settlements. Settlements produced by private entrepreneurs who failed to complete formal land registration. In this case, however, the inhabitants bought the land and are able to prove so in court. The physical structure of the settlement is usually regular and grid-like, but they almost always lack infrastructure. Like this. In sum, these metropolises were historically constructed in a broadly radial and concentric urban fabric with vast and quite homogeneous peripheries, only minimally assisted by state policies. We shall see in a moment that some of these features have changed substantially over the last decades. So now let's say something about the legacy of state policies towards cities. Brazil is a federal republic in which municipalities are politically autonomous units with the power to elaborate and deliver several types of policies. The responsibility for providing housing is shared between 3 levels of government, and planning is local, urban planning. Public housing was introduced by the federal government in 1937, but resulted in a very low number of housing units distributed by clientelist and corporatist schemes. Mass housing production had to wait until the 1964 military coup, when a major policy sector was developed by the federal government: a national financial system, a major funding source, a federal bank, and 27 state-level public housing companies who provided houses directly. But this policy produced only one single product: new units in large-scale housing projects on the outskirts of the city for long-term financial sale. And this is a legacy in Brazilian cities that is very difficult to work with. This policy also produced mistargeting, corruption, and very low-quality housing, which were also very segregated. More importantly, regardless of its scale, and it was really a massification of the housing policies in Brazil, the policy failed to confront the challenge posed by mass migration and high fertility rates. Brazil's urban population jumped from 31 million inhabitants in 1960 to 80 million in 1980, resulting in a widespread adoption of the precarious solutions already mentioned. This policy declined in the 80s, and the federal bank was abolished in 1986, leaving behind some of the previous institutions, but very, very low budgets and no central policy to organize federal actions and to guide local governments. During this period, lacking any federal housing policy, the urban population leaped again, rising from the 80 million in 1980 to 161 million in 2010, without any policy from the federal government. So we get to the third and final part of my presentation, which is tries to focus on the most recent social and urban policies and transformations in cities since the return to democracy. Well, in the 80s, at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. This period represented a moment of major political and social changes in Brazil. After a long period of military rule, civilian government returned to power in 1985. Indirect presidential elections were held in 1989, following intense political mobilization across the country. Both the labor movement and local urban grassroots movements were very important agents in the regime transition, pushing for more participation, accountability, and public policy reform, both nationally and locally. The 1988 Constitution consolidated many of these demands for democratization, including the redesign of several public policies. Since then, the Brazilian federal arrangement was reformed in most public policies through a policy-specific transference of implementation capacities and resources to states and municipalities, but with the federal government retaining broad financial and decision-making capacities. These processes substantially changed the Brazilian social welfare system with intense pressure from below and from technical communities. This is a key point, since Brazilian social policies were only slightly influenced by neoliberalism, despite its presence in the discourses of political actors and its presence in macroeconomic policies, which were really influenced by neoliberal ideas. Consequently, despite their many problems and weaknesses, Brazilian social policies have never been as strong as they are today. At least in the case of basic policies and services, social indicators have risen, and access to public services and policies has improved in the large majority of the country's metropolitan areas, reducing the intensity of social deprivation in a clear trend towards universalization of basic policies. Poverty and economic inequality have also fallen substantially in the last years. Between the 80s and the 2000s, the federal government disappeared from housing and urban policies. This reduced financial resources, but allowed the creation and dissemination of alternative policies by local governments in a wide range process of policy innovation. In institutional terms, municipal governments developed elements such as participatory councils, new financial arrangements, and redistributive zoning. In housing, the list includes social rent, renovation of housing projects, but mostly slum upgrading, regulation of irregular settlements, self-construction associated with the state. Several of these policies were federalized after 2003 with the creation of the Ministry of Cities. This led to the creation of several new institutions, including federal laws, funds, councils, national conferences, and a national housing plan in 2003, as well as important changes in mortgage and financial regulations which liberated market housing production for middle-income families. This is only to give you an idea of the change in the pattern of finance for housing in Brazil. This money going to housing, both public and private, which was liberated by changes in the way mortgages and financial regulations were produced. Also, two major infrastructure and housing improvement programs have marked the return of the federal government to the urban policy sector since 2006. They are called Growth Acceleration Program, and a strange name, maybe a bad name, My House, My Life. The two programs have been experiencing implementation problems, which reduced their pace, but also problems of design, especially in the My House, My Life plan. The program introduced very important innovations, opened subsidies for very poor families for the first time in history, and a quite fast implementation strategy. But there are also very large problems. The lack of federal regulations on project locations in the cities and on the necessary infrastructure may be producing a new wave of segregated projects and neighborhoods. These are only examples of housing projects, recent housing projects in several cities. There's another one near Rio. These are beautiful, okay? So now I have chosen some who are not. This is a typical mass production of housing. There's a more traditional one, and there's an ugly building. Regardless of these improvements, Brazilian metropolises continue to be marked by intense land irregularity and inequalities. In spatial terms, the structure of macro segregation has changed little, and centers of the metropolis have remained highly exclusive. But peripheries are becoming increasingly heterogeneous, not only in urban terms, but also in terms of the social groups they house, mainly due to the increased presence of low middle-class inhabitants. A similar phenomenon has happened in the shanty towns, in the favelas, making it more accurate to talk today about peripheries and favelas in plural, and not periphery and favela in the singular. Urban violence and a widespread sense of insecurity have become central features of urban sociability in recent times, leading on one side to the production of gated communities and enclaves of wealth, and on the other side, impacting the sociability and the social organization of the poor in the urban peripheries. This is a very important topic, but I don't have time to develop here, but this is a major topic for the daily lives of the persons. Finally, urban social activism has become more heterogeneous since the 90s, in part due to the presence of other channels for participation and political action under democracy, including NGOs and participation in several types of public policy delivering schemes. The recent period also saw the dissemination of identity-based and social-cultural movements in the peripheries. Taking into account all these processes, therefore, it's not enough to describe Brazilian metropolises merely in terms of the widespread poverty in homogeneous peripheral spaces lacking basic services and policies, as I described earlier. Also, the idea of a radial and concentric urban form may give a general description of its structure, but does not describe a significant part of the metropolitan territory, and urban life is produced in the details, not in the general patterns. On the other hand, it would also be inaccurate to state that poverty and inequalities are now over. Metropolitan spaces are now more heterogeneous, and the state is increasingly present in the daily lives of the poor, although in incomplete and selective ways. Large social and income inequalities still persist and will not come to an acceptable level in the near future. All these elements increase the heterogeneity of social situations and turn the construction of citizenship into a complex and often somewhat contradictory process.
Going back to the figures that Kundu pointed to at the beginning, we see quite contrasting trends in terms of rates and urbanization. So why is it that exclusive cities in Brazil still support an increase in urban growth, but increasing the exclusive cities in India seem to be depressing rates of urban growth? Do you have a kind of answer to that conundrum?
Very similar question. Just build on that. How come there is such a remarkable similarity of patterns of super rich and rich, engaged communities and others in very poor conditions, poor infrastructure, shortage of water, and everything. And this is right across in China and India and Brazil, despite major difference in their constitution, arrangements, and government structures.
Hi, question. This is for Eduardo, possibly also for the others. Reading an article recently, last month, I think, in the Financial Times, about Brazil in the 21st century and how far it's come in a very short period of time. In the article, it's mentioned, I'm paraphrasing, about Brazil in the 21st century mirroring the affected states of North America before the Civil War. How would you respond to that?
Maybe we'll go ahead and start with those three questions first.
I'm not really sure that I got exactly your question, but urban growth in Brazilian cities is very small today, tends to be very small. The larger the city, the smallest the growth. And this is in the case of São Paulo, growth is very small since the 80s. But new growth was huge between the 1930s and 1980. So the large majority of the problems, the social problems, are not for several decades Malthusian problems, around two different, what the states before the Civil War for me is a divided country, considering different trajectories for the country, with different strategies for development, which included slavery in one part, industrialization, slavery and rural activities, and industrialization in the north. And Brazil does not seem to have this problem, but I think I'm very happy with the interest Brazil has now internationally, by obvious reasons, as a scholar, but also as a Brazilian. But I think a lot of people are too optimistic about what Brazil will do in the future. Brazil has a lot of potentials, but has a lot of problems also. The Brazilian political system is a very complicated system. It's not very, so I think we'll have a lot of problems.
Thank you for this question. I'm a part of a larger project covering 5 countries of BRICS, which addresses the strengths in the organization in Brazil, India, and of course the other countries, South Africa, China, and Russia as well. We are raising this issue that how come when in Brazil you find that there is slight declining trend in the urbanization and urban growth rate at 80+% of the population. In India we are at 30%. And we find similar exclusionary trends. The question that you ask is that, of course, there is anti-migration stance taken by the middle class and upper class in both the countries. But how come the outcome turns out is somewhat different? You find in Brazil, as represented, is the presence of state in housing in a big way. I am a chairman of a committee to determine housing shortage for the 11th plan and also for the 12th plan that just submitted to the government. Now, I find that although government talks about housing for the poor, eliminating housing shortage in a time-phase manner, there is some kind of elite capture in the whole process through which it is translated. And actually, in the name of affordable housing, you find massive subsidies like money housing. And actually, the poorest of the poor has said that the monthly paying capacity would not be more than 700 rupees per month. They fix up at 2,000. Obviously, the poorest of the poor would never get these facilities. So, I think this is an important issue that how come the urban middle class and the upper class in the Indian city context have been able to capture urban space much more effectively through, let's say, in case of Delhi, the participatory movement, in case of Bangalore, the Jawaharlal movement, which is again a movement of the urban middle class. In Mumbai, it's an advanced locality management. They are all resident welfare associations. They are creating gated communities. A student of mine worked on public interest litigations, and he noted that in the 70s, most of the public interest litigations were filed to stop eviction by the civil society organizations. But now, in the last 15 years, most of the public interest litigations are filed in the court to get evictions done, because the urban middle class wants their parks and these roads to be clear. So I believe that although at the highest political level there is a need and concern for poorest of the poor, but the space of policy making and also the urban space particularly seems to be really captured by the urban middle class, which is not really allowing things to happen. I'm really very happy to note, and I'm going to take this back with me, that presence of the state in the housing sector with the poor. Whereas in India there is, this is a program, massive program of Rajiv Awas Yojana, which talks about making India slum-free. That's a really major announcement that the present government has made. But when you find its implementation, you really find that the middle income people come in the picture and you actually end up giving massive subsidies which go to finance the so-called the middle class in the country, and the poorest of the poor get excluded. Thank you. See, because I was very impressed by the similarity of the problems of organization, I would say large city-based organization in China and India. You talked about the food issue, which is not a major problem in India, because we have cheap food sufficiency right in the early 80s. But water is being brought from long distances for the city population, pollution, the ecological footprints of the big cities going to the neighboring areas. But you concluded by saying that earlier the thrust of was to move from rural areas to cities, but now to cities and towns. Now, if that is a part of the government policy, that is something remarkable. Because in India also we are talking about move to cities and small towns. But it seems at the policy level, they would rather create big cities because the reshaping of economic geography has told us that there is agricultural economies in the big cities. Several big cities are being created between Mumbai and Delhi in the arid zone where there is water shortage. Water will be brought from the seashore. Desalination plants will be there. There are ecological issues. Where in India we are also talking about move to towns, but this is coming from the people, civil society and researchers. Whereas most statements which will come from the state, and it is possible for the Chinese state to really change the gear of organization and shift from large cities to small towns if the state wants. What would be your suggestion in this context for the Indian situation policy?
So the
closed communities or big communities because they are not communities. There's no idea of community behind the production of those things, differently from the US, where you have people who go to sailing communities, big communities, and stay there and have a marina for everybody. In Brazil, they are about security, but they are mainly about status, privilege, and exclusivity. There's a wonderful example of this in Teresa Caldeira's City of Walls book, in which she has the book is about native communities in São Paulo, and she has the facsimile of a flyer of a development called Las de Vosges, like the French one. And it was Place de Vosges, and in Portuguese, in the flyers, the main difference is that that ours is private. So I think this captures the idea that they are getting really privilege and status.
Well, with that, I think we'll adjourn to the reception. Thank you all very much for coming, and if you would please join me in thanking our speakers as well.
Come.